Concerned that Colin's lack of 40k lore knowledge is a bad look for the game, an unnamed game company has set in Professor Bailey Stromkarius with critical instructions. Colin has just 12 weeks to become fluent with 40k lore, or he'll fail their test and the repercussions will be dire. Acknowledging the severity and timeline of the situation, Colin has set aside 20 minutes a week to prepare. This is that 20 minutes. Welcome to 40k Lore Crash Course.
All right, questions. Cool. So I understand that that sci-fi and fantasy is very built on itself, right? I understand the importance of Tolkien. I understand the importance of a lot of the Swedish children's stories, and all this stuff kind of fits together. I don't remember sci-fi from the early 80s when a lot of this was originally come up with. In your opinion, how new are these concepts, or are the concepts basically all purposefully hammer over the head copies of things?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And to be completely honest, yeah, you're welcome. To be completely honest, 40K is very unique in a lot of ways, in the fact that it doesn't necessarily like rewrite human history. It just kind of adds onto it, which is interesting. But as far as like the books that were being written, obviously I wasn't necessarily reading these in the 80s, but that being said,
for those that want context, I was born in 79. Just for those that want context.
So you probably weren't reading these in the early 80s either.
No. So I learned about it in 94.
Okay.
Like that. Go ahead.
All right, cool. Yeah. So I've read a lot of this old sci-fi because I do love old sci-fi.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Looking at some of these, so we can look at like the 40K is unique in a lot of ways, but it does, like most large universes, take things from other universes. Now, the unique thing about 40K is a lot of the later sci-fi universes, like we think about Alien, we think about some of the other really big sci-fi, at least I would consider large sci-fi universes, Star Wars, they take things from 40K, I think, a little bit, certain elements. Sure. I would assume Star Wars might get the pass because A New Hope really was kind of a thing of its own to a degree.
Yeah.
But if we look at like the Dune books, for instance, like that's a really popular show right now. If you've watched Dune and the second Dune Part 2, and
this is an important tangent. The first Dune book is actually where I lost my ability to read fiction.
Yeah, it's where there's so much.
It's where I just couldn't deal with my ADHD anymore, and I just threw my hands up. It was just, as I got older, I tried to go back and read Dune. I read it as a teenager, and I told everybody, I hate this book. It's so stupid. Yeah. I can't stand how badly written this book is. It's one of the most famous sci-fi books of all time. So my friends convinced me to go back to it, knowing that I'm struggling to focus on fiction, even though I love it. I've always loved stories. I've always loved it. And so I'm starting to read this, and halfway through it, I just hurl the book aside, and I haven't gone back to reading. I read nonfiction, but I haven't gone back to reading fiction.
Yeah. So, and that first book is probably the one that makes the most sense. Now, this might make some people mad because I know there's some, and I don't want to enrage our audience, but I have read the Dune series.
Sure.
I like the way the show has changed it because I'm going to be real with you. Some of the stuff that happens in the second and third book is just like, what is going on? Like this is like so crazy out there, which I guess that's science fiction. That's what they want, but it's still like, whoa, like when he has his son who's like half a snake, half a worm. That's kind of crazy. Sorry if that's a spoiler to anyone, since we haven't got there if you've been watching the movies, but
well, the connection for me to the kind of the connection between 40K and, well, there's two things that really stand out to me as this kind of connection between pop culture and 40K. The first of which is the Necrons, right? Like the Necrons are very obviously a love letter to Terminator. They're not before Terminator. They are not a magical thing that existed before Terminator. They are very obviously Terminator. And I am completely fine with that. I think it's great. But if you zoom back, I remember someone's going to Google this, late 90s when Starship Troopers came out.
Yes.
And I went to see Starship Troopers with Chuck and other 40K friends. And it was impossible to go see that movie and not just watch a 40K movie. It was literally a 40K movie.
Hero Guard versus
from beginning to end. But even that book is older than 40K, I think.
Yes, the book is, yes.
So that makes me wonder if a 40K nerd was looking at that book and like, well, what if we just do Tyranids? But
yeah, I definitely think 100%. And I think when it comes to certain factions, especially like you just mentioned, the Necrons, like we can mention kind of with the Tyranids, with Starship Troopers, there are, especially with the alien races, they definitely do steal some stuff from other stuff.
Yeah, which is fine. I don't have any problem with that. Okay, next question. I don't know how to handle this. I think that there's very serious Christianity things going on, connections.
Yeah.
And it is interesting to me to think about how much of that is intentional and how much of that is just that a lot of the Christianity origin story stuff is very mapped to other mythos. I'm sorry. I'm being I'm raised in the church. I'm not trying to be disrespectful here. I'm saying that there are a lot of religions in the world, and if you look at their origin stories, a lot of the stuff is mapped to each other.
Yeah. As a history professor, I can confirm this.
All right. So, what is your thought on that? Is there purposeful Christianity stuff going on here? Connections and joking or seriousness?
100%.
All just this is just the way the world is.
No, I definitely think there is. I think there is some serious ties to it. I think there is some paradoxical ties to it. There's also a character that still believes in God in the Horus Heresy.
Okay.
His name is All Person, and he's a perpetual that has fought in every war humanity has ever.
And he thinks there's one God. He's a monotheist.
He is the Christian God. Yahweh is who he believes in. Is what's very heavily directed that way.
Okay.
And Malkador mentions it a little bit. And there's that amazing short story where the Emperor burns the last church on Terra. And he speaks to a very almost like Greek Orthodox priest. And they basically have this discussion where the Emperor talks about like Christianity. And he says, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. The morals of religion are good to a degree, but the outcomes are so devastating to humanity. And that's kind of where I think that's the lesson 40K. And then much later on, when the Emperor is deified and we have all of these horrible things the church does, the Church of the Emperor, I should say, in 40K later on, when we learn about all these terrible, terrible things, it's kind of that same deal. The idea of what the Emperor's vision was good. Mm-hmm. The morals of it necessarily were good. What has been taken and corrupted and changed has made something like so terrible. So I don't actually know if there's like an actual because when we say it like that, there definitely seems to be an underlying
Well, I think that so to me, there's a core concept so my dad has a master's degree in modern European history or something like that. And so growing up, every World War II movie that had ever existed, I watched with him. And one of the things that he talked a lot about was that entire part of the world, even though Europe is not the Middle East and is not Israel and is not everything else, that entire part of the world is just completely crafted by the Crusades. It's completely designed. The whole thing goes back to that. And no one's going to argue with me on this. The Crusades is one of the most significant things in human history. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. But my point is that if you look back at that, taking that core mechanic and putting it into the story makes the story incredibly relatable, right? All of real humanity understands what the Crusades means in the raw scope. And we also have all seen religion put people to war. So I didn't know in the storytelling that there was kind of the Emperor doesn't want to be a god, but his people think he should be corruption, which I think is really interesting.
Yes,
because I wouldn't want to be a god, but if everybody around me was telling me that I should be a god, that would be hard for me not to just be like, okay, cool, I'll be a god then. Sounds dope.
And as we go later, not to jump too far ahead of the lore, which you might find this interesting, just to add on to the end there, the Emperor does basically become a fifth chaos god in the current lore, more or less. But unfortunately for him, he is broken to his throne and can't say no, can't say yes. He's just a god because enough people believe in him.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
I dig that. I've got lots of Emperor questions for another day. I had an interesting observation. So the Space Marines, yes,
Mhm.
they were sent off to their homeworlds, but then all of them were found on their homeworlds, or sorry,
The
excuse me,
Primarchs.
the Primarchs were found on their homeworlds. Then the Primarch, in many cases, and the Space Marines went on a murderous rampage in the Emperor's name. Yes?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I believe that we have the best example ever of murder hobos.
Yes, that's unfortunately is the hard part of when we're kind of smoothing over the facts, because I think that's one of the best things is when we're reading the Horus Heresy books, you actually get to see every book in Horus Heresy ideally is written by a different author. That's kind of the cool part of them. And
Okay.
it's kind of round robined by all these amazing Black Library authors. And each one tries to write the book so that you are empathetic to the Primarch and the Legion you're reading about.
Oh,
So you might, so like in the case of like Prospero Burns and A Thousand Suns, which is one's through the eyes, the burning of Prospero, the destruction of Magnus and A Thousand Suns through the eyes of the Space Wolves. The other one is through the eyes
there's
of
a
the Thousand
box over
Suns.
there that has models in it that says that
Yeah.
on it.
Exactly. And when you look at those two events, when you read those two books, you root for both sides
Mm-hmm.
because they're written so masterfully. That's one of the things I really like about both those books.
Yeah, that's neat. I was trying to explain to my kids why this show concept, and I don't know which of these things I'll use and which of I won't. I was telling my kids about this show concept, and none of them even understood the amount of lore that is involved, right? So to them, right, the scope of World of Warcraft is massive, right? Like I played World of Warcraft for, I don't know, a decade. I literally have no idea how long it was. It's all a blur. But I got to a point where I was very interested in the story, but I just couldn't follow it anymore because there was so much happening. Yeah. And you can take all of that Blizzard has written, and those of you that know the Blizzard and Games Workshop history are laughing right now. Yeah. But all of the you have all of this content that they wrote for World of Warcraft, right? And 40K dwarfs that by such an amazing amount that it's hysterical, right? Yeah. Like you've got a decade, you've got 15 years of a company making lore for a video game, and these authors are just cranking these Black Library books out.
Oh yeah.
And I think that it's just really neat. And so,
and for the most part, they're all good.
As
they? Someone who's read almost all of them, except for maybe some of the Age of Sigmar ones, and I'm working on that. Just personal preference kind of makes that hard sometimes. But as someone who's read almost all of them, I mean, like they're all pretty good. Because I've read some bad.
Many of the authors are like actual accomplished, real. They're not like. Yeah. They're not like we found this guy who can write sci-fi. They're like a real accomplished author.
Yeah. Well, like Dan Abnett, he writes for Marvel. He does storylines for the comics.
That was literally the name I was going to say.
Yeah, and Dark Horse. I mean, like, yeah.
Okay. I have two more questions. Let's see. What were they? Oh. This is for me to edit back in. Hi, Colin. Hi, new Colin. Future Colin. Okay, so you mentioned in that segment just now that you talked about the idea of an unreliable narrative. I'm going to start this again. Okay, we have to tangent for a minute. You talked about the idea of an unreliable narrator. You brought it up several times. Yes. And when I explained and got feedback for this show, the feedback I got from my lore nerd friends were the two things Colin needs to understand when making the show. Not that you have to learn. The two things you need to understand is unreliable narrator. Everybody who's telling the story is unreliable. And the second thing is that it is a parody, not a satire. Mm-hmm. And I want to hear your thoughts on that. So, and I'm now going to have to edit this part out. This is before you talk about it. This is before you're going to talk about it in the sub-segment we just did. Yeah. So you just mentioned it in the thing, because I was going to ask you about it, and then you went into it. So you've just talked about it, and this is spliced in.
Yeah, perfect.
Right, go ahead.
So I don't think I truly understood this idea of a parody and an unreliable narrator until I finished The End and the Death Part 3, which is the last book of the Horus Heresy series. Well, I guess there's one more coming out. They're not going to stop putting them out, but it's supposed to be the last one. They told us it was. Anyway, but but book 99 of the Horus Heresy, I finished it. And when you're reading this, the thing that really got me was, as I'm reading through these books, we all know the overarching idea of the Horus Heresy ends with the Emperor and Horus dueling it out on a bridge.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
with the duel of snakes playing in the background. Yeah.
Exactly. And we have this idea of what it is because we have artwork for it. It's been in literally every one of these codexes behind me has some, well, maybe not the Tyranid ones, but all these other ones behind me have some element of explaining this like core mechanic of the story. Every core rule book, every source book that's in the White Dwarf magazines, everything. The funny thing is, I was reading this book, we have these predestined ideas of what happened. Like there's this talk of maybe there was this lone guardsman who distracts Horus for a brief second. We have this stuff of like all of this information. And as Dan Abnett, who wrote this last book, great author from Black Library, he goes through and he touches on a lot of these little tropes that have been kind of offhandedly written into codexes, and he makes them part of the lore in this book.
Okay.
And shows you,
example? What's an example?
So like this idea of a lone guardsman standing between Horus and a wounded emperor, making just enough of a chink, drawing enough of Horus's attention for the emperor to strike a lucky blow, basically.
Okay.
In the book, during the Siege of Terra, World Eaters and Word Bearers and Iron Warriors are assaulting this position that has been kind of left to be destroyed. And there is a Sister of Silence who is basically a little subsection to the Adeptus Custodes. They're these blanks. They have no psychic. So they're kind of hard to see, actually, because they have no soul. So people with souls have a hard time seeing them. There is a random guardsman who you follow through all the Siege of Terra to this last moment. And he's hanging out with this super crunchy veteran soldier who's been fought in the Crusades. And now he's back on Terra. And he's like fervently believer the Emperor's a god.
Okay.
They're fighting. The soldier's name is named Saul Everson, I believe is what his name is. Okay. And the veteran crunchy soldier. The young guy, they're being attacked by Khorne berserkers. They have this banner of the Emperor Ascendant that they're raising up, and they're all getting murdered because there's like 20 dudes. They've run out of ammo. They're trying to fight Khorne berserkers hand to hand.
Right.
And this Sister of Silence, which none of them can actually see her because her soul is so void, saves them. So she jumps down, she cuts off a bunch of heads, she kills a bunch of Khorne berserkers, and then she runs off after saving their lives. But the guy, the crunchy soldier, had been holding that banner and had just unfurled it when their heads all just kind of fall off and all the Khorne berserkers die to their eyes. And so they're like, this is crazy. And then so as the book goes on, this story keeps popping up as soldiers are telling it to each other during the battle. And basically by the very end of the book, the story is gone that this Saul guy, this crunchy veteran, actually was on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, and he steps in and saves the Emperor's life. But it's funny because that, until this moment in the book, has been legitimately the lore. If you were reading in the codexes or stuff like that, was that a random guardsman saved the Emperor's life? And that's not true at all. That's not what happens on the bridge. Okay. But that's the lore that the Imperial Church will then rectify, and we as the readers are getting.
So the unreliable narrator, that makes great sense to me. And it's a fun way. So I've done a bunch of writing as a hobby throughout my life. And I find that it's much easier for me to write as Colin, right? This is the way Colin speaks. This is the way Colin writes. And when you do that, when you change the tone from Bailey went to the school to pick up his daughter to this vibe of, oh man, Bailey on his way, he was over there to the school. And, when you change that vibe, the expectation from the audience changes. And I hadn't thought of that before as a concept, as a narrative concept. So, and then the other thing, I actually Googled the definitions because I know what parody is and I know what satire is. But if I'm going to be given the feedback that this is a really important thing to know, I'm going to look at them.
Yeah. And
aside from the general definitions, I think the important note is that satire is mean. Like it doesn't have to be mean, but it's mean.
Usually.
Right? Like satire is saying this thing's so stupid that I'm going to make fun of it to point out how stupid it is, right? It's the Daily Show. It's Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, right? It's those shows. Mm-hmm. Whereas parody is loving, right? Is affectionate, is playful. And so that's a neat concept for me to think about as we're going through these stories, because it's like, oh, I've heard this before.
Yeah.
Right. Oh, well, yes, you have, but this is purposely making fun of that. Right.
Yeah.
But in a playful and fun way.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be really helpful as we go through.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more.